Far above the places travelers believe they know, there are maps that lead to the edges of the known world. And then there are the spaces between the ink, where the paper seems to thin and quietly unravel. While most travelers keep their eyes fixed on the summit, they rarely notice how the shadows stretch into the hollows when the air turns sharp with cold. This account was found tucked inside a water-warped ledger in a high-altitude ranger station abandoned for over 30 years. It tells of a place missing from all satellite imagery, a pocket of silence hidden behind a veil of white. Under a sky the color of bruised slate, the ascent began, the wind whispering through jagged limestone peaks. I followed a trail that was little more than a memory, overgrown with silver-leaved ferns, tangled with ancient gnarled roots. As I climbed higher, the air grew heavy and damp, carrying the sharp scent of wet stone and something metallic, like a copper bell ringing far away. My boots crunched against loose scree, the only sound in a world that felt as if it were holding its breath for a coming change. Ahead, the trees began to thin, revealing a wide, bowl-shaped valley. And there, a thick, predatory mist was rising, filling the space. It didn't roll in, it simply materialized, a weight pressing against the chest, muffling the very soul of the forest. As the fog settled, the familiar landmarks of the ridge vanished. They were replaced by a wall of impenetrable white that felt strangely warm against my skin. I stopped to check my compass, but the needle spun in lazy, erratic circles. It was as if it had forgotten which way the world was supposed to turn. In the absence of direction, I followed the natural slope of the land. I descended into the heart of the mist, where the silence was absolute. The ground beneath my feet shifted from rugged mountain soil to something smoother, more deliberate. It felt like hand-laid cobblestones, worn down by centuries of rain. Then, the first shape emerged from the gloom, a tall, narrow house with a steeply pitched roof. Its timber frame was black with age. It stood perfectly still, a skeleton, a home waiting for a pulse that had long since faded. I walked further into the sudden clearing, and a dozen more structures materialized through the shifting curtains of the fog. The village was laid out in a perfect circle around a small, dry fountain. Its architecture was a strange blend of styles that didn't belong to any single era or culture. There were no power lines, no trash, and no signs of modern life. There were only the hollow shells of buildings that seemed to be watching my every move. The windows were dark and vacant, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the glass was vibrating with a low, subaudible hum. On every doorframe, deep grooves had been carved into the wood. These formed intricate geometric symbols that looked like eyes or interlocking stars. They weren't decorative, they felt functional, like seals meant to keep something either firmly inside or strictly out. Far above the green hills and quiet forests, a small cloud floated alone in the blue sky. And down below, I approached one of the larger houses near the center. My hand hovered over the cold iron latch of the heavy oak door. Before I could touch it, a faint amber glow flickered in the window of the second floor. It cast long, distorted shadows across the street. It was the soft, rhythmic pulsing of a lantern, but it didn't flicker like a flame. It breathed, expanding and contracting with a mechanical precision. I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs as other windows began to wake up with that same ghostly light. There was no sound of footsteps from within, and no voices calling out. There was only the silent illumination of rooms that had been empty a moment before. The village was no longer a graveyard of wood and stone. It was waking up to the presence of an intruder. A sound finally broke the stillness, a faint, rhythmic clicking, like 1,000 wooden beads being dropped onto a stone floor all at once. It drifted from the forest at the edge of the village, where the trees rose taller, darker than any I had seen on the climb up. I turned toward the noise, and there, standing among the pines, were a series of tall, thin poles, each one topped with a rusted metal sphere. They stood like sentinels, quiet, waiting. Small sparks of blue light moved between the spheres, dancing gently, tracing invisible lines through the fog, creating a soft hum that made my teeth ache. These were not relics of a primitive past, but something far more sophisticated and far more alien to this mountain range. The pulses moved in time, with the lanterns glowing in the windows. It was a silent language of light and frequency spoken across the deserted streets. Far above the quiet moment where I stood, I found a leather-bound journal lying on the edge of the central fountain. Its pages were damp, but surprisingly well preserved in the mountain air. When I opened it, the handwriting was frantic, the ink bleeding into the paper in jagged streaks that suggested a hand trembling with haste. The entry spoke of the fog keepers and the cycle of the glimpse. They described a place that moved through time the way a ship moves through water. One passage mentioned a man who had stayed too long. He watched the fog lift and found himself standing in an empty field with no memory of how he arrived. Another entry was just a single sentence, repeated over and over, until the ink ran dry. Do not watch the lights for too long, or the lights will begin to watch you. I tucked the book into my jacket, and the weight of it felt like a cold stone against my side. As I looked up from the journal, I realized the whispers had begun. This was a soft murmuring that seemed to come from the very walls of the houses. It wasn't a human language. Instead, it was a collection of sibilant sounds and sharp consonants that echoed off the cobblestones like dry leaves. I followed the sound toward a narrow alleyway. There, I saw a shadow move across a patch of light. It was tall and unnaturally thin. It didn't walk so much as it drifted. Its form blurred at the edges, as if it were made of the same mist that choked the valley. I called out a greeting, my voice sounding flat and alien in the heavy air. There was no response. There was only the intensification of the whispering. The shadow paused at the corner of a building. It was a silhouette of something that was almost a person. Then, it dissolved back into the white. The air began to thin, and a sudden freezing wind swept through the village, tearing at the fog, revealing small patches of the dark, starlit sky above. With the movement of the air, the lanterns in the windows began to dim, their amber pulses slowing as if the village were losing its grip on the world. I looked back at the house I had first seen. For a fleeting second, I saw a face in the upper window. It was a pale, featureless mask looking down at me. It didn't have eyes, only dark depressions where eyes should be. It didn't move as the mist began to pull away from the timber walls. Panic flared in my chest as I realized the boundaries of this place were failing. The ground beneath me felt less like stone and more like air. The village was retreating, pulling back into the hidden folds of the mountain, and I was still standing in the center of its heart. I turned and ran back toward the slope, my lungs burning as the oxygen grew scarce and the temperature plummeted. Each time I looked over my shoulder, another house had vanished, replaced by the familiar, gnarled shapes of the mountain pines and the jagged edges of rock. The blue sparks on the poles hissed and then died, leaving only the smell of ozone and the wind howling through the pass. I scrambled up the scree, my fingers clawing at the frozen earth, climbing until I reached the ridge where the trail had first disappeared. When I finally reached the top and looked back down, the valley was empty. A vast expanse of gray stone and silent trees under the cold light of the moon. There was no village, No fountain, no lanterns, only the vast, indifferent silence of the peaks. The journal I had recovered felt unnaturally cold against my chest. It was a physical anchor to a place that shouldn't have existed. I sat on a jagged outcrop of rock, my breath hitching in the thin air as I watched the valley below for any sign of a returning flicker. The transition had been too seamless, a surgical removal of reality that left no scar upon the landscape. My flashlight beam cut through the dark. It revealed nothing but the ancient, indifferent granite and the twisted limbs of stunted pines. There were no cobblestones here, there were no iron latches, and no geometric symbols carved into the wood of the trees. It was as if the mountain had simply reset itself. It was shaking off the memory of the village, like a sleeper brushing away a dream. I opened the journal again, and my light trembled over the frantic script that filled the middle sections of the book. The author, a man named Elias, spoke of the resonant pulse. This was a frequency that vibrated through the marrow of his bones whenever the fog thickened. He described how the village didn't just appear, but instead it synced its vibration with the physical world, creating a bridge of sound and light. According to his notes, the lanterns weren't fueled by oil or electricity. They were powered by the focused intent of those who had become trapped within the cycle. He wrote of rooms that changed their dimensions depending on the time of day. He described hallways that stretched into the forest without ever crossing a threshold. And the more I read, the more the silence of the mountain ridge felt like a heavy shroud. It pressed in from all sides. Driven by a restless, uneasy curiosity, I began to circle the perimeter of the valley. I was looking for any physical evidence of the structures I had walked through. Near a cluster of lightning-scarred oaks, I found a single rusted gear, half buried in the dirt. Its teeth were worn smooth by a friction that didn't belong to the elements. Beside it lay a porcelain doll's head. Its painted eyes stared upward with a vacant, terrifying clarity that seemed to mock my search for logic. I picked up the gear, and a faint vibration hummed through my fingertips. This was a ghostly echo of the blue sparks I had seen on the sentinel poles. These were the debris of a collision between worlds, the small, broken things that the tide of the fog had forgotten to carry back. The mountain wasn't empty. It was merely hiding the machinery of its secrets beneath a layer of dust and time. As I ventured deeper into the woods surrounding the vanished village, I noticed that the trees themselves were different here. Their bark was carved with the same symbols I'd seen etched into the doorframes. The cuts were fresh, sap oozing from them like molten amber, glinting in the dim light. And when I looked from the corner of my eye, the patterns seemed to shift. It was then I understood. The village wasn't merely a cluster of buildings, it was a living entity, its roots entwined with the very ecology of the mountain. The symbols were a language of containment, a way to anchor the ethereal forms to the physical earth, so they wouldn't drift off into nothingness. I reached out to touch one. A sharp electric jolt shot up my arm, leaving the metallic tang of copper on my tongue once more. The air began to grow heavy again, not with moisture, but with a static charge that made the hair on my neck stand in rigid rows. I heard a low, rhythmic thumping from beneath the ground. It was like a massive heart beating deep within the tectonic plates of the range. It was the sound Elias had described as the grand harmonic. This was the signal that the veil was beginning to thin for its next scheduled manifestation. I looked at my watch, but the hands were spinning backward. The mechanical ticking was replaced by a wet, organic pulsing. The forest around me began to blur. The sharp edges of the trees softened into the gray-white haze of a rising phantom tide. I wasn't just a witness to the village's return. I was standing directly in the path of its re-emergence. A soft, melodic whistling drifted through the trees, a tune that felt ancient and hollow. It was carried on a wind that blew from nowhere, not the wind of the mountains, but a draft from a doorway left open in a house that hadn't been built yet. I saw a lantern light ignite in the distance, suspended in midair where a second-story window would soon materialize from the mist. Then another appeared, and another, a constellation of amber stars, forming a map of a street that was, for now, nothing but shadow. The ground beneath my boots began to harden, the soil and roots surrendering their form to the smooth, cold geometry of cobblestones. I stood frozen as the wall of a house rose up beside me, the timber groaning as it forced its way back into our dimension. Far above the shifting sounds of the valley, the transformation was louder this time. A deep, resonant cacophony of grinding stone and snapping wood echoing like distant thunder across the valley floor. I watched, slowly, as the dry fountain assembled itself from the air. The cracked stone drew itself together, piece by piece, with a sharp, fragile sound like breaking glass carried on a quiet wind. The village, it was fighting to stay. Its structures shivered with a violent energy, trembling in a way that felt as though the forest itself might split apart under the strain. And then I saw it, the tall, thin shadow again. Still, silent, standing in the center of the emerging square, its featureless face lifted toward the sky, as if listening to the stars themselves. It raised a hand, and the blue sparks on the sentinel poles roared into life, flooding the valley with a flickering wash of neon and shadow, pulsing softly like an unsteady heartbeat. The village hadn't just returned. It was anchoring itself with a desperate, renewed intensity. I retreated into the doorway of a shop that hadn't been there seconds ago. The wood smelled of salt, ozone, and very old dust. Inside, the shelves were lined with jars of gray powder. There were glass spheres that hummed with a soft, internal luminescence. There was a ledger on the counter. It was open to a page dated for a year that hadn't happened yet. It was filled with names I didn't recognize. My own name was scrawled at the very bottom of the list, the ink still wet, shimmering under the light of a nearby lantern. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This place didn't just exist in the fog. It collected those who wandered into its reach. I wasn't an explorer discovering a mystery. I was a recorded entry in a ledger that spanned across the centuries. The whispering returned, louder now, a frantic chorus of voices rising from the jars on the shelves. They weren't asking for help. They were reciting coordinates, dates, and the names of mountain peaks that didn't exist on any map I had ever studied. I backed away from the counter. My hand brushed against a glass sphere, and it immediately turned a deep, bruised purple at my touch. The vibration in the floor intensified, a steady, rhythmic thrumming like a countdown toward a final, permanent integration. I looked out the window and saw that the fog was no longer white. It had become a thick, swirling vortex of black and silver, obscuring the sky entirely. And the village was no longer a glimpse. It was becoming the only world that mattered. I tried to turn back toward the door, but the handle was gone. It was replaced by a smooth expanse of unblemished oak, warm beneath my hand. The walls of the shop began to shrink, drawing closer. Little by little, the ceiling lowered, inch by inch, as the whole structure settled into its final physical form. I could hear the clicking of the wooden beads again, this time coming from inside the walls. A frantic, mechanical scuttling, the sound of unseen gears. I reached for the journal in my jacket, but it was gone. Only a faint, rectangular bruise remained on my chest where it had rested. I was trapped in the architecture of a ghost story, a guest in a house that only existed when the world was looking the other way. Far above the shifting walls of the shop, the wood grain moved softly, almost like water, settling into its final place. I pressed my palms against the door, feeling the faint vibration of 1,000 hidden gears turning deep beneath the village. Outside the window, the amber lanterns flared, bright and blinding, casting long, sharp shadows that seemed to slip free from the buildings themselves. The whispering grew, rising into a trembling fever pitch, a collective sigh of countless voices, finally finding their place in the silence. And in that moment, I understood. The village had not simply appeared in the fog. It was a sanctuary, a resting place for the things the world had forgotten how to see. My breath came in shallow gasps as the room settled at last. The air grew cold, still, filled with the quiet scent of ancient dust. Stop here. Far behind the shop, I found a small, iron-rimmed window. It had not yet fully solidified, its glass still swirling like liquid. With a desperate shove, I threw myself through the opening. I tumbled onto the cold, damp cobblestones of a narrow alleyway. Above me, blue sparks from the sentinel poles arched overhead. They wove a canopy of electricity, humming with a low, mournful frequency. I ran toward what I hoped was the edge of the settlement. My boots echoed with a hollow, metallic ring against the stones. Every house I passed seemed to lean inward, their eaves overhanging like heavy brows above the dark, vacant eyes of their windows. The village was no longer a discovery. It was a labyrinth designed to keep the wanderer from ever finding the exit. In the center of the square, the dry fountain was now flowing with a thick, silvery liquid. It didn't follow the laws of gravity. It rose in delicate, impossible arches before vanishing into the air. It released a soft chime that vibrated through my very teeth. The tall, thin figure stood beside the basin. Its long fingers trailed through the shimmering stream as if playing an invisible instrument. It turned its head toward me. Though there were no eyes, I felt a profound sense of recognition wash over me. I wasn't an intruder to this being. I was a missing piece of a puzzle it had been assembling for an eternity. The figure raised a hand. The sound of the clicking beads stopped instantly. This left a silence so absolute, it felt like a physical weight. Far below the silent sweep of the mountains, I didn't wait for a gesture or a word. I simply turned toward the dark line of the forest where the fog seemed thinnest. The ground beneath me began to soften again. And the shift back to earth and pine needles came with a slow, sickening sense of vertigo. I could feel the village tugging at the hem of my jacket, a quiet magnetic pull trying to draw me back into the amber light behind me. The sentinel poles hissed as I moved past them, their blue arcs snapping at the air like thin whips of pure energy. I didn't look back, not until the smell of ozone had faded from the night. And when it did, it was replaced by the honest, biting cold of the mountain air. My heart was a frantic drum, steady and urgent, a rhythm of survival that pushed me upward toward the safety of the high, lonely ridges. When I finally reached the crest of the mountain, I collapsed into the snow. My lungs burned with the sudden return of thin, sharp oxygen. Below me, the valley was a sea of white. The fog was so thick and uniform that it looked like a solid floor of clouds. There were no lights, there were no sparks, no silhouettes of pointed roofs pierced the veil of the mist. I reached into my pocket. I hoped to find some token of the shop. I looked for a gear, a glass sphere, or even a splinter of the timber. My hand closed around nothing but a single crumpled page. It must have fallen from the leather journal before it vanished. It was a map. It was hand-drawn and shaky. The landmarks it depicted were not of this mountain. They were not of any other mountain I had ever climbed. Far above the ridge, the stars above were cold and distant, their familiar constellations offering no comfort to a mind that had seen the world's seams. I stayed there until the sun began to bleed across the horizon, turning the fog into a brilliant, blinding gold. As the light touched the valley floor, the mist dissolved with a sudden, unnatural speed, revealing only the empty, rugged terrain of the wilderness. There were no ruins. There were no foundations. There were no signs that a village had ever occupied the space between the peaks. The mountain stood as a blank slate once more, its secrets folded back into the dimensions that only open when the air grows heavy. And so, I began the long descent back toward the world of men, knowing the path would never feel the same under my feet. Far above my own thoughts, it felt. I returned to the ranger station weeks later, moving slowly through the quiet of that place. The ledger I had found was gone. The shelf it had occupied was now covered in a thick layer of undisturbed dust. The rangers spoke of the Fog Valley with a kind of casual indifference, as if its stories were nothing more than shadows drifting through an empty sky. They dismissed the legends as hallucinations caused by altitude and isolation. They pointed to their satellite maps that showed the green and brown expanses of a world they believed had been thoroughly measured and mapped. I didn't argue with them. There is no sense in explaining the color of a dream to those who only value the waking world. But sometimes, when the weather turns and the clouds sit low on the hills, I find myself checking the doorframes of my own home. I look for the symbols. I look for the silent carvings that mark the boundary between what is real and what is merely waiting to be seen. Stop here. The map sits framed on my wall now, a still reminder of a place that lingers only at the edge of vision. I trace the lines with my finger sometimes, slowly, wondering if the ledger still holds my name in its wet, shimmering ink. Some places aren't meant to be conquered or claimed. They're meant to be seen only once, and then left to the quiet. The village beneath the fog is still there. I'm sure of it. It glows with its amber lanterns and that soft mechanical heartbeat. It waits for the next hiker to wander too far. It waits for the next soul to step off the marked trail and into the white. And in the quietest hours of the night, I can still hear the gentle, rhythmic clicking of the wooden beads. They're calling me back to the square. The map does not show the way home, but the way deeper into the white. Some paths are only revealed to those who have already lost their way. Would you like me to generate the images for these scenes on different profiles as you requested?